spot for us. Sometimes we would go through 212 to get to the Black Hills and go to Flintstone Land and you know, all of those great tourist traps. And then on the way back, we would swing back through Gillette because we wanted to go to the Devil's Tower. And so that was always a highlight. And so I was very disappointed earlier this summer. My wife and 4 of my children came through Gillette and visited the Devil's Tower without me. Yeah, and I had been looking forward to it and talking about it for a long time. Gosh, I want to get over there because now I live kind of more central Montana, and most of those folks vacation in western Montana instead of coming out this way. But so my daughter, was her 11th birthday, and she wanted this miniature husky. And so the lady who had it was over on the far side of South Dakota. So she said, we'll meet you in Rapid City. So my wife and them drove all the way over here. I was actually putting on an opera along the Yellowstone River over there in Montana. And so I was tied up with that and not able to come. So now I'm glad I'm able to finally come and get over here. And I'm going to allow my host to say a few words.
Well, you're already getting to know our speaker for tonight. So I do have some announcements. I will probably do most of those afterwards. The one big announcement is I'd like to thank the Rockpile Museum Association for tonight's presentation. They co-sponsored this event with the museum. So thank you to all the members and the board of the Rockpile Museum Association. So I'm going to get right to our speaker. Shane Doyle is an educational and cultural consultant who hails from Crow Agency, Montana. Now based in Bozeman, Dr. Doyle is engaged with many professional projects, including curriculum design for groups like the National Native American Hall of Fame, environmental advocacy for groups like the Montana Wilderness Association, archaeological and genetic research for Montana State University and the University of Copenhagen, and an assistant artistic director and performer for Mountain Time Arts, and that's the opera, right? Yep. Shane is currently the lead coordinator for the Montana Warrior Spirit Curriculum Design Project and assistant producer for an upcoming Indigenous Day of Acknowledgement to commemorate Yellowstone Park's 150th birthday. So without further ado, Dr. Shane Doyle.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. What a great honor it is to be here. And I just appreciate everyone coming out this evening. And you know, I have a lot of different things that I do and a lot of interests. And so I'm going to open it up for questions towards the end for all of you who have specific interests as well. But I wanted to kind of cover a broad overview of the history of this region. And I wanted to give you a little background on how I got to where I'm at studying this topic. And so I grew up on the Crow Indian Reservation and later on went to college in Bozeman. And during that time became a singer of Plains Indian style music. And so I've been singing for over 30 years now with the drum group and that style of music. And so that's really allowed me to travel to all of the reservations and to really learn a lot about Native culture, Native people, and contemporary traditions, contemporary music and song and dance, you know, traveled the powwow circuit and everything. And then as an educator and as a researcher, I became involved with archaeology. And it was never my intention. I was never really all that interested in archaeology. But I kept having people always asking me to participate in archaeological research endeavors. And then in 2013, I was introduced to a group of archaeologists. I had already been friends with them, but they introduced me to a geneticist from Copenhagen, Denmark, who had completed the sequencing of a 12,600-year-old boy that had been found not far from Bozeman, and about a mile from the present-day town of Wilsall in the Shields River Valley. The Shields River was named after one of the members of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and it's a tributary of the Yellowstone. And so it's not that far from the big Paradise Valley that goes down into the park. And so at that time, I became involved with the repatriation of the ancient boy, and so I helped facilitate and was a liaison between the universities and the tribal communities in Montana and elsewhere. And so we had a successful reburial, and then we wanted to continue doing genetic research because none of the tribes in this region have ever been sequenced. So we don't know about their genetic history. We know literally nothing about Lakota, Shoshone, Arapaho, Crow. None of these communities have ever agreed to be sequenced, and so we don't know how closely related they are to one another. We don't know how long they've been in this region. A lot of different things that we could probably evaluate with that type of study. So thus far, we have not completed any studies, but we're getting closer, I think, every year. Hard to believe that's been 8 years now. But so those were the two strands that I became familiar with, was contemporary American Indian culture and ancient history. And I felt when I began to learn about these two topics, it occurred to me that, wow, there's a great big white spot there on the map. And there's a lot of things that we don't know about, and that is, who were these people that walked around here on foot for thousands of years? You know, we seem to know a lot about the native people who were here after the horse came, and some of the issues that come up with that are, by the time the horse arrived here on the Great Plains, a lot of these communities had really been shattered and turned upside down because of disease. They'd lost over half of their population, and so they were an unprecedented crisis. And so what we think we know of as the people who inherited horses as these kind of untouched communities were in fact actually heavily impacted and dramatically altered in only a few short generations because of smallpox epidemics that arrived here as early as the 1780s. So when Lewis and Clark came in 1805, what they were looking at, the people who they encountered had already been substantially inundated with disease. And add to that disease theme the new elements that were coming from the Western world: rifles, horses, blankets, steel pots and pans. By the time Lewis and Clark had arrived, the horses had beaten them by many, many years. All of the communities that they engaged with were full horse cultures. Now imagine them being some of the very first non-Indians to enter into this region and come to a place where your culture had preceded you by a good 50 years. I think it was probably difficult for them to really grasp that, all of those circumstances that surrounded their infiltration here. And then, of course, we know a lot about the colonial history here. After the mid 19th century, when gold is discovered in Virginia City, of course, we have the South Pass that becomes very relevant in 1849 with the gold rush to San Francisco, the Sacramento Valley. And so that's when things get really dramatic here, right? And of course, that's when the Indian Wars come about. That's when the treaties are signed. There's a lot of blood that's spilled. There's a lot of high drama. There's a lot of high tension. And that's what all the movies that we watch are kind of based on, and a lot of the books that we read are based on. And that's very interesting, and I'm very interested in that. And I've done a lot of work with interpretation and reinterpretation of the Little Bighorn battle, because I grew up literally on the battlefield. My stepdad he just passed away, the reenactment for 30 years, him and his brothers. And I participated in a History Channel program on the Little Bighorn battle. So I'm very well acquainted with the battle. I'm very interested in all that history. But what I really wanted to know was what happened before all that. What happened before the horses came? What happened that 12,000 year stretch there. And I began to dig deep into the archaeological history, and was always kind of left a little bit wanting for the personalities, the stories. And so I made it a quest of mine to understand more deeply and more meaningfully the culture of this region, the ancient culture of this region. So that's kind of how I got to where I'm at today. And so thanks for bearing with me on that. And so I have a book that I've been working on and a theory that I've been working on. And it's entitled, I guess the book is entitled Messages from Medicine Wheel Country. And I've got variations of this presentation that I've been giving for several years. And, you know, there's just a lot of different things about Medicine Wheel Country. There's a lot of messages that I think that are worth learning and taking in and seeing what they have to offer to each and every one of us personally, and of course as a society and as a state and nation. And so this image here comes from the famous national landmark, the Bighorn Medicine Wheel, which is of course is just to the west of here and to the north. And you have to go all the way across the Bighorns and all the way over to the western edge till you finally get to it. For those of you who haven't been there, I encourage you to get there sometime. It's a beautiful spot. And this is basically what it looks like, the way it's drawn here, traced onto this, this image here. This is what you'll see if you go to the wheel itself. There's a little display there. It talks about a lot of the science involved with the wheel, how the cairns line up to certain astronomical events at certain times of the year, a rough age for the wheel, you know, a few other items about it. But it also mentions that there is a theory that this is where the Sundance ceremony comes from. I can tell you it's not a theory. It's an ancient oral tradition. You know, there's not some guy in some room reading a book that theorized this. You know, this actually came from native people. They've been saying this for a long time. You know, the medicine wheel is where the Sundance comes from. You know, I don't think there's any question about it. Everybody that I've ever spoken to in Indian country believes that's pretty much common knowledge. And so I kind of want to speak to that a little bit as we go forward here. But this is the medicine wheel country. And so, yeah, and I know this is going to be hard for us to read, especially those of you in the far back. But kind of an image here of the medicine wheel country. And we are located right around here, that perfect little spot, kind of where the Powder River comes up, and you've got the Black Hills over there. And so what we can see there is that this area here is really what I like to refer to as the medicine wheel country. And going up into Canada, it's kind of cut off here by the image, but if we went up here into Canada, the topography looks a lot the same. And over this area here, we have found, archaeologists have identified well over 100 medicine wheels. Now we know that there are like millions of teepee rings on the Great Plains, but medicine wheels not so much. They're much harder to identify. They're easier to disturb, but there have been, again, over 100 identified. There's a book, there's a few books out on them. One recently published, well, it's been about 5 years now, from a researcher out of Canada who was looking at the wheels. And so why would we find the wheels just in this country? You know, as soon as we leave this region, and I think we find them all the way down into Wyoming, but as soon as we get past this area, we don't really see them much anymore. but certainly all through here. And there's certain cultural features that we see the native people had here in this region, and I'll get to that in a moment. But some of the things that distinguish the medicine wheel country. Okay, for one, we have these island mountain ranges. And so for here, for example, we have the Black Hills. And all throughout, moving to the north and over into the northern Powder River country, we still see pine hills speckle the countryside. As we get up into central Montana and along the Missouri River, we see, you know, island mountain ranges. Of course, the Bighorn Range down here. And the importance of the island mountain ranges is that those really enable the ancient Plains Indian way of life, because the ancient Plains Indian way of life was all contingent upon lodgepole pines. And so you can have a lot of bison and you can have all those wonderful resources that you need, but if you don't have lodgepole pines readily available, you're not able to construct a teepee. And dogs are not good at dragging teepee poles. And I think all of us are probably, you know, on the same page with that. Those of us who love dogs would never, in our wildest dreams, tie a lodgepole to them and expect them to take them someplace. I think in the old days, dogs were used, they would put small little travois on them and let them carry small items just because you don't have enough in all your hands, but certainly nothing heavy. And so the idea of dogs hauling a camp and lodgepoles en masse, I think, is not realistic. I think it's more, we have to assume that ancient people left their lodgepoles in their winter campsites for their return. And then as they traversed the ground, open ground during the summer months and during the season when the snow was not on the ground, to hunt and trade, that they would find poles along their way at different places where they would stop. And then also, of course, during the summer and during the fair weather seasons, the teepees are not as important as they are during the winter. And so that's one of the significant things that's different about this area compared to Colorado and further south onto the Great Plains. You cannot find lodgepole pines out onto the Colorado plains. And in fact, there was a very minimal amount of native culture out there, historically speaking, because there's not a lot of rivers out there. And so when the Comanches finally began to inhabit that country during the 19th century, that was all because they had acquired horses. But before they had horses, that country was really inhospitable. I don't think it was a good place to live, and no one really lived there. And besides that, they couldn't find any teepee poles out there. And when the Comanches, of course, acquired horses and became this empire of horses, they dragged their poles. The horses were able to do that for them. But for thousands of years before that, this area where we're at was the prime spot for bison hunters, for people who understood how to live the bison way of life. Also, what we find from the island mountain ranges is fresh water. Again, as I mentioned earlier, on the southern plains, it's a hard commodity to come by. But especially in central Montana and around the Powder River area north of here and all along the Yellowstone country, there's lots of fresh water and into the Black Hills. And so that made winter survival possible. And then there's plant and animal diversity in the island mountain ranges. So you see different medicinal plants, you see different animals that will inhabit those ranges year round, whereas the bison will only be in certain areas seasonally. So the mountain ranges provided a food safety net. They were winter campsites there because out here on the Great Plains, you have to have a good spot to camp for the winter, and it's got to be by the water. You should have some wind protection. because even in a log cabin, if the wind is blowing, you cannot keep it warm. We all know that. And then, of course, we have ceremonial sites in the mountains. So places where people would fast, continually go back to have ceremonial, to have seasonal ceremonies, sun dances, sweat lodges, or other ceremonies in the mountains. So the island mountain ranges provided that. Also, an excellent wild plant and animal habitat, high protein grasses here, rivers, lakes, and wetlands, berries, roots, and and also, of course, the dry climate, which allowed for all of it to occur in favor of the native people. So without things being dry here, the ancient way of life, the ancient bison way of life, wouldn't have been possible. As we know, everything here dries out. Even when it rains, as soon as the sun comes back up, the rain, it just dries up real quick. And so that was a key to their ability to store food, to dry meat, to build their lodges, because things wouldn't rot as long as you were able to expose them to the sunlight and the dry air. And then, sorry to kind of rush through this, but I have kind of a lot to cover. And then the cultural nexus. So here out on the Great Plains, there's a cultural nexus that occurs from all different directions, people coming from different climatic areas, and of course through the Rocky Mountains and from the east for trade and for other things. And so I guess since I've kind of delved more deeply into ancient way of life here on the Great Plains, I always emphasize hunting, gathering, and trading, because trading was just as important as hunting and gathering to them. And I always think about us, contemporary people. All of us, if we could feed ourselves and clothe ourselves and house ourselves, it wouldn't be good enough, because we would still want to interact with our neighbors, wouldn't we? Unless you want to be a kind of a hermit and just do everything by yourself, like the Unabomber or one of those guys out in the woods. You want to interact with your family, with your friends. It's nice to be able to have lunch together or have dinner, or see what each other's up to, trade things. And a lot of times, all we trade is stories and laughter, or we trade one another's presence. Just being in the company of each other is comforting enough, especially over the past year and a half, as we well know. Just being together is important. And it always kind of, after I started really thinking about this, I think it's really, it's too bad that trading is never mentioned with hunting and gathering, because we've reduced ancient people to these two-dimensional characters who only have two things on their mind: hunting and gathering. They don't have any interest in seeing one another or hearing new stories or finding out new dances or seeing new girls or stuff that all of us want to do today. And that's part of what makes the world go around, right? And so I think that that's an important aspect of the ancient culture that hasn't ever really been brought to the fore. And so that's one of the things I seek to do with my work. So again, looking back on the boy that I was able to help repatriate, and the study that was done on him, he was 12,600 years old. And for those of you who are not familiar with him, he's known as the Anzac boy. And he was buried with 118 Clovis artifacts. So it's the largest collection of Clovis artifacts ever discovered. and also the only person ever associated with Clovis materials. So there's never been another human remains discovered with Clovis artifacts. So that's part of the reason why there was never able, scientists were never able to confirm the identity of who Clovis people really were until 2013 when the study came out and we found out that the boy was an ancestor to probably 80 to 90% of all the Native Americans in the Western Hemisphere. So one of the very first families on the continent, on both continents, was just up in central Montana along the Shields River. And so, you know, those people, they lived quite a life. They were hunting woolly mammoth. That was one of the things that they hunted. You know, for those of you who have never hunted woolly mammoth before, you might have your chance here. I think they're getting ready to bring them back from the extinction, or it's the last I heard. But you might want to be careful. You know, they weigh 11,000 pounds. They run 35 miles an hour. And they've got ivory tusks that are about 10 feet long and very capable of defending themselves with their tusks. So they're not the kind of animal that you want to take lightly when you start to hunt. I can't imagine hunting them. First of all, they would never die with a single shot. No, it would take at least half a dozen severe wounds probably before this animal began to bleed out. And during that time, it's going to be pretty ornery, I can imagine. So you would want to have some type of strategy to avoid getting killed by a mammoth. That was just one of the things that they did. You know, they also survived living through the Ice Age in Montana, not like it's cold enough here as it is. Add the Ice Age on top of that. And, you know, they were face down with short-faced bears, ancient bears that were man-eating, that stood about 15 feet tall, literally, dwarfed a modern-day grizzly bear. Saber-toothed cats, American lions. So when you think about some of the predators that they shared company with, I can't imagine that too many people in history have had to face those kinds of enemies down on a daily basis. So it's extraordinary to think that this little boy that was buried with a timeless treasure in his tomb during a time when people had to have been very much poverty-stricken in the greatest sense because the resources were so scarce, and the obstacles that they faced every day were so difficult that they would dedicate such an amazing treasure to this child, I think is a beautiful story. And if you want to see a little bit more about that, there was a PBS documentary that was done on it. It was nominated for Emmy back in 2016. And the name of the documentary is called The Great Human Odyssey. And about an hour and 14 minutes into it, there's about a 22-minute piece on the Anzac child, if you want to learn more about it. So that's part of the reason why we know, again, that Native people go back 13,000 years here. I've also been involved with ancient ice patch research in the Beartooth Mountains. And if you ever want to watch a short video on that, you can Google ice patch archaeology. And so the oldest artifact ever recovered from an ice patch was taken from the Beartooth Mountains just about 8 years ago. And it was a 10,000-year-old atlatl dart. So people were up there hunting a lot. There was a lot of people up there at 10,000 feet, 10,000 years ago, which is really a revelation for a lot of scientists. And so last year we were up studying the ice patches. We always go up this time of the year. And so we just completed a 3-year NSF grant. The team's getting ready to go up there, I think, this week to do the ice core sample. But last year when we went up there to sample the ice, there was a group of elk hunters that were there before the sun came up. And so when the ice core drill team got there, they really were annoying them because they were ready to hunt elk, and here were these researchers showing up with all this equipment. And they asked them, "What are you doing?" And they said, "Well, we're here to hunt elk." And they said, "Well, why do you hunt elk here at this ice patch?" And they said, "Well, we come to this ice patch every year because all we have to do is sit here and wait. And the elk come right to this ice patch every year, and they just stand around and lay down on it. They like it because there's no bugs on it, and it's cool. And a lot of times they'll just lay down and fall right to sleep. So we just shoot them right there." And what was interesting about that was that when we went up there, a lot of the scientists were saying, it's so weird that they would be hunting around ice patches. Why would animals have anything to do with ice patches? You know, there's nothing for them to eat there. You know, there's no smell of grass. You know, so they were they didn't understand, but we learned a good lesson that morning. That in fact, there's a lot of reasons apparently why elk and other animals go to ice patches. So we know that from the ice patch archaeology and from the genetic research that's been done that people have been here on this landscape for 13,000 years. And during that time, they developed a lot of cultural traits that allowed them to thrive here. And so I became really interested in what those traits were. And so we can see they understood the behavior of bison. They were experts on bison behavior. They knew where the bison would go. They knew when the bison would be there. They knew why the bison moved. They understood what would excite the bison. They understood what would draw them in. They understood how to get the lead cow to start running. They understood that bison, like all ungulates, don't like to put their foot in anything risky, thus a cattle guard. So that's what a drive line is. They understood that if they could make lines along the ground, that the bison would stay inside of them. Very polite, these bison. They like to stay inside the lines. They also traveled the same patterns every year. These guys weren't explorers or anything like that. They just kept going the same way, the same place that the grass grew, the same place that the winds blew them to seasonally. And so they were very predictable. So native people didn't do a lot of guesswork, historically speaking. They were pretty sure where they went, they were going to find what they were looking for, which was a lot of times bison. And of course, with wild plants, that's a given. That's an understood. The plants will be in the same place every year, such as choke cherries, all the different wild berries and roots here on the northern plains. So they developed a seasonal way of life here. And they followed seasonal circles just like the medicine wheel. So again, here we go back to this medicine wheel theme, concept, traveling in a circle, a balanced circle. And while you're taking your time, you're going to meet people who are doing the same thing. And just like all of us every summer, you know, we're kind of hunkered down during the winter. We're working. The days are so short. You know, the sun goes down so early, and then it's a long night. So we think of what we're going to do, right? And by the time spring comes, we're ready to get out of here. We want to go look around and meet some people, hear some stories, you know, see some new country. And luckily for all of us, we all speak English. So wherever we go here in America, we find people that speak our same language. And it's real easy for us to get around because we can read and we know all the signs, and now we have phones, so it's a completely different world. But back in those days, everyone had their own different language here. So we're talking about over a dozen different groups with different languages, and none of them had a single word in common. So they had to develop a language that would allow them to trade, communicate effectively. So they developed this sign language, and it's really an achievement because there's never been anything like it. There's never been another language like plain sign language. You know, you think about the greatest universal languages like Swahili, for example. Well, Swahili is at its heart Swahili. It belongs to the Swahili people. There may be a lot of people who speak Swahili, but it still belongs to the Swahili people. This language here has no words in it, and it doesn't belong to anyone either. It's purely conceptual language that was developed simultaneously by many diverse linguistic groups. And how often has that happened in history? It's never happened. And why not? I wondered that, and I've thought about that a lot. When has there been a time in history when we haven't needed a universal language? Think about Europe. Think about Africa and Asia. I mean, think about places where you have huge, enormous populations, all speaking different languages, all needing some way to communicate with each other. But the tensions and the competition never allowed for that to grow and develop. In order to develop a language like that, it almost has to be done by a group of scholars outside of the realm of regular human contact. Because if it's done in our regular society, there's too many different intervening factors that work to disintegrate that process. And so what they were able to achieve here was something that came about because of a long time stable, peaceful tradition. Why were they peaceful? Well, for one thing, they had no horses. So there was no way to raid a camp. And if you did, you would have to be carrying it like this. Or maybe you could put it on your back. But in the meantime, there's a whole bunch of people chasing after you. They're not carrying anything, so they're probably faster than you. They've been at their house drinking water and eating food. You just came from a long ways. Who do you think has the advantage? What are the odds that you're actually going to make a successful camp raid during the days when everyone walked on foot? It just didn't add up, did it? The math doesn't play out. And so what you get is people who understand it's much better off in your best interest to have successful, peaceful relations with your neighbors, because you continue to get things every year, and you set up your children next year, and your parents have been doing this anyway. That's why they taught you sign language when you were a little kid, not because you were hearing impaired, but because they wanted you to communicate with all your neighbors who you were going to see every summer when you traveled that wheel, that circle, that migratory route, where you harvested the berries, where you saw the bison, where you used the ancient drive lines that had been established by people hundreds, thousands of years before you. For the same migrations, because the winds still blow the same way, the grasses still grow the same way, and the water still flows in the same direction. And so as long as those things are in place, the animals will figure it out. You know, the bison, they have really good nose. You know, they're not good as far as seeing, but they can really smell grass and water, and they're really good at getting there. So here's a little factoid for you. Some of the languages that come onto the Great Plains here, you can see each one of these colors here indicates a different language family. And so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different language families on the Great Plains. And all of those different language families have their own dialects and different branches. So Siouan probably has at least a dozen, Algonquin as well, and they're not mutually intelligible. So if you speak Lakota, you will not be able to understand Crow. It will sound a lot the same, and there will be a few words that are the same, but mostly you'll not know because they've been apart for too long. So again, that's why the need for the sign language and the way it was developed over the course of many generations and was continued to be passed down right up into the 19th century. And there are a few speakers of it today as well. I want to briefly touch on the history of my tribe. We came out here from the Mississippi River Valley area about 500 years ago. We followed the dream of a visionary leader who saw the Bighorn Mountains as the place where we were meant to be. And along our way, we brought corn, beans, and squash, and we tried to plant all of them along the Yellowstone River. And we had one good spot by Glendive, and it's called the Hagen site. For those of you who are interested in archaeology, there they find remnants of an ancient Crow village, Crow pottery, stores of grain on the hillside, corn, beans, squash, where they would dig big pits and store them, and then roast in them the corn as well. But we kept on moving further up the Yellowstone, and it got harder and harder to farm. And so eventually, there's a place along the Yellowstone River between Big Timber and Livingston called Springdale. And the Crow name for that place is where the corn died. And I'm sure it died at many more places besides that. But that was like the furthest west that they tried to plant corn. And then after that, they said, no more corn. And they quit farming, and they became these full-time hunter-gatherer traders. And that is very different from the rest of continental America, because almost every place else where there was a decent supply of water, and I guess this doesn't count, but where you have riverways and stuff back east, you see the growth of agriculture, corn, beans, squash especially. And then we also had pottery. This pottery here, these shards here, were found along the Yellowstone River, a tributary of the Yellowstone River. And this is Crow pottery. And so we were making the pottery, and what we would do is they would take mussel shells and break them up, and then they would mix the broken mussel shell powder into the clay, and it would help with the conductivity and also give it this shimmer, kind of a real shimmery look about it. And so this is an example of some of that pottery. But when horses came, they found out that as they traveled on their horses, their pots kept breaking. So they quit. They quit making pottery. And their lives became so different with horses that the pottery just kind of became a thing of the past, along with the corn and the beans and the squash. And so some of the remnants of change that we see over the cultural history of the people. Now, very quickly here, we can see, again, this is the medicine wheel itself and how it so closely resembles a Sundance Lodge. So this is a Blackfeet style Sundance called an Ocon. And so again, this is a ceremony where the people go in and they fast with no food or water. Very extreme ceremony. I have never seen anything like it in the world. I've never seen this thing replicated, or the fasting, the no water. The Northern Plains tradition of fasting with no water for days, which your doctor would not recommend, but was part of all of their major ceremonies. Very ceremonial way of life. So that ancient way of life, they had very few possessions, and I always try to emphasize this towards the end of my presentations. They had very few possessions because they were always traveling in that circle. So what they really valued was their spiritual wealth. They were always trying to build their spiritual wealth. And that's why they kept fasting all the time. That's why they had all these extreme ceremonies. It wasn't just good enough to go through the motions for them. They had to really completely dedicate themselves to this cause that they would get this spiritual medicine. Okay, just a little bit more to kind of round things out here before I get to questions. This is kind of a colonial map, and we can see the French were trading rifles up north with the Cree and the Blackfeet, and the Shoshones we're gathering horses from the south, from the Comanches. The Comanches are a Shoshone-speaking group of people. And so they made their way out onto the northern plains, and then through the trade networks, very quickly become the modern way of life. And so you have a light infantry, and you have these very mobile bison hunters. This was the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1850. I didn't really get down into Wyoming. You can see that would be Sioux country, Dakota.
And the Arapaho, Shoshone over there.
Yep. And then Arapaho, Shoshone over here. The giveaway. So very reciprocal way of life. Again, here's a circle, kind of the medicine wheel, people gathering in a circle. And this is an old photo of a family that's giving away items to show their appreciation for their success. And that's still a ceremony that occurs today. Also, some of the ceremonies occur today, naming and adoption. So these are ceremonies that are believed to pass, again, spiritual medicine over to your loved ones, either through naming them, giving them a name that is important to you, or seeking someone out to give a name to your child. And adoption. Adoption is very much a fundamental aspect of Plains Indian life. The idea that, you know, your family is your wealth, and having more people in your family is going to make you richer. That's going to be ultimately what you treasure the most. So yeah, so that'll do it, I think. And I'll go ahead and take some questions. Thank you very much.
Hey, I'm Mike Stone, Pumpkin Beach chapter, Wyoming Archaeological Society.
Yeah.
Have you done any research on other high altitude villages near Medicine Wheel?
You know, we haven't actually looked at any high altitude in the Bighorn Mountains. We've only looked at Beartooth. I'm not sure how many ice patches there are in the Bighorns, but I imagine they're probably up around Clouds Peak. For the Beartooth Plateau has probably about at least 15 to 20 ancient ice patches. And we've looked at least half a dozen of them. Some of them are real easy to get to. You can see them right from the road. So they make it real easy to study, whereas the Clouds Peak or some of these other ones on the Bighorn would be harder to get to, I think. And like the ice core sample, the ice core drilling equipment, you almost have to have a vehicle to drive that stuff around, you know. And so we haven't studied the Bighorns at all. And I hope we can get to it. One of the reasons why we're doing it is because the ice patches are slowly melting. So we're trying to get to them before, you know, because as soon as these artifacts come out of the ice, they're so old. If they're made out of organic material like wood, you know, they'll disintegrate really quickly. So we really have to find them that season. Otherwise, something will get to them, or the weather will kind of, you know, just kind of destroy them. Good question.
You said there's 100 medicine wheels.
Yep.
So is our medicine wheel in the Bighorns the furthest south? Because you said I inferred that most of them were north up into Canada.
There's that's a good question. Thanks for asking. No, there's some down in the Wind River too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I just had a conversation with a friend over there, Eastern Shoshone guy that I'm friends with, and he sent me a photo of one. I don't know how authentic it is or if it's new. He didn't know either. Hard thing about medicine wheels, a lot of times they're really difficult to date, you know, and just for a number of different factors. I don't think the one in the Bighorn has ever really been established to date. I think 3,000 to 6,000 years maybe is the oldest. and that's if they can find some wood in there. But yeah, most of the wheels are found on the northern plains up into Canada. There's one along the Bighorn River, just outside of Fort Smith on the Crow Indian Reservation. That's a real interesting one that people have been going to. The Crows have known about it for a really long time. One of the reasons why it's really interesting is because it's not on a level surface. Half of it, so you know, when the river comes out of the Bighorn Canyon, there's some great big huge bluffs, you know, that go down into the river. Because in the old days, it was such a huge torrent of water coming out that it carved this great big river basin. And so on the bluff there going down just outside of Fort Smith, the wheel, half of it is on top on the flat surface, and then it's pretty, well, probably about 45-degree incline.
Really?
Yeah, and the other half of the wheel is on that downslope. And every time we go, I mean, everyone always says, why did they do it like this? And no one has any idea why they would do it like that. Maybe they were trying to go for three-dimensional or something. I don't know. But that is one that we know of. There's also another one on the Crow Reservation in the Crow Wilderness area on the eastern side of the Bighorns, but it's pretty small compared to the one up top. And so I think there's like, the Crows know of at least 3 or 4 on their reservation. And then there's one on Wind River. And I think, you know, I'm not sure why they're not further south. I'm pretty sure I know why they're not in the treed areas like to the west and to the far east, obviously, because they're irrelevant. You know, the only reason why the wheels are relevant is because we can see everything.
Yes.
We'll be able to see the moon come up in a little bit.
Yep.
In fact, there it is.
Yep.
You know, and the sun just went down, and pretty soon, you know, we know where the Big Dipper is going to be tonight. It'll be up here, and Orion will be right over here,
Not yet.
and the North Star is going to be right over here, because we've all been looking at this for so long, and so the wheels make perfect sense. But if we lived in Kentucky or New York or Virginia or Washington or Oregon, we wouldn't be able to see the moon right now. You know, we would be in these tree areas, and there wouldn't even be a place to build a wheel. And you know, so a lot of the wheel has to do with that the open country, and the open country has to do with the dryness, and the dryness ties back into that preservation of meat and berries and hides, and also the openness, I think, played into the plain sign language, because they could see each other from long ways away. And they needed, you know, that's probably how it originally came to be, you know. Yeah. So yeah, good question. Yeah.
Are you aware of Medicine Wheel on the south end of the Bighorns?
I'm not aware of that.
It's up in the Bear Trap area. I've only been there a couple of times. You have to walk to get to it, so you have to drive to get to it.
So it's kind of like on the down low, huh?
Yeah.
Is it on private land?
No, it's right across in the Turk Ranch. It's on BLM land.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's interesting, huh?
Yeah.
See, there's always people that have inside knowledge, and you come to these little things here and find out stuff. I always find out something from the audience all the time. Thank you for sharing. You know, I think they really kind of symbolize our country in a way that very few other things do. You know, they're kind of like, the other thing I really like about them, and coming here to the Rockpile Museum, I love that name. And so at the opera that we did, I had to give a little monologue, and it was pretty cool. You know, it was at night, and I was all dressed up, and I had one big reservation hat, and they had these lights shining up when we were by the Yellowstone River, and there was this girl sitting next to me with a slide guitar, steel slide guitar. Yeah, it was really fun, and the speakers were on, and I had to like create this atmosphere. And my whole monologue, I decided I'm going to talk about rocks, because that's really all that the native people here left behind was rocks on their ground and bones in the earth. and there's all different kinds of rocks that they left behind. You know, there's the ones that they fashioned to knives and arrow points. And then there's the rocks that they used for the medicine wheels. And then there's the rocks that they used for the teepees. And then there's the rocks that they used for the sweat lodge, where they heated them up and brought them into the lodge. And then there's the rocks that they used for the drive lines to herd the bison. I mean, you could go on and on about all the ways that they use rocks, and almost everything that you see is rocks. And, you know, there's this idea that Stone Age culture was so lacking. But, you know, I don't see it that way. I mean, I certainly would want to have a few more things in my life besides rocks. But, you know, I mean, if you're going to live a life full of rocks, that's the way to do it. And then when you're gone, there's like, wow, there was nobody here. It doesn't look like there was ever anybody here, you know? Yeah, and, you know, the water's still clean, and there's a lot of animals here. And so it was kind of an ethereal way of life that they lived. And the rocks kind of symbolize that. You know, they were here and then they were gone. Well, they're still kind of here. We're still here. But that way of life has kind of gone for now. But like I said, you know, the wind still blows and the grass still grows and the water still flows. And so we all have that to fall back on. Is there any? Yeah.
This is probably an impossible question, but I've wondered about it a long time. When it comes to oral tradition, how much history do you think it can preserve? It's easy for us to kind of know the history of like the last 3 generations, but beyond that, it gets more and more difficult.
Yep. We've lost.
I don't know how. I mean, yeah, lots is lost, but I wonder if can you safely assume that an oral tradition can preserve 200 years, 300 years of history, or I don't know. I've always been on my mind.
Well, it's a great question. Let me briefly try to answer it. First, oral traditions are far more than just stories about the past. You know, oral traditions are songs, they're ceremonies, they are our sensibilities. That's part of our oral traditions too, you know, how we take care of our home, or how we fix our hair. Yeah, recipes, a lot of those things. And so some of those things endure for a very long time, maybe not even consciously. But I think for something like Plains Indians, I think that now we have oral traditions that can be transferred digitally. And so we're in a new realm, right? Like now we can, you know, transfer the language onto an app or put songs onto your iPod, and, you know, they're there for, you know, who knows how long. And so that's one way to preserve the oral tradition that we never used to have. And I think without that, honestly, without that, I don't really know, that question becomes much more difficult to answer.
At least these symbols, like the medicine wheel, could persevere for thousands of years.
Absolutely.
I mean,
especially now that they're protected, like the one up here. You know, it's a national landmark. It's never going to be.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
It's a beautiful thing. I think it's a great legacy for all of us, and that's all of our inheritance here that are here in this area. You know, I've always believed that. I mean, no matter what whether it came from, if you were born here or not, doesn't matter. You're here now, and you know, that's part of your culture where you live. Like the Devil's Tower.
Yeah. Well, it can be also verified. Look at a large area. The story is common between different tribes, between different groups. The common party, if I say it's probably going to be pretty accurate.
Yeah. You know, one thing I didn't get to, and I'll save it for the next time I come back, was the star stories, the stories about the constellations that the Northern Plains people share.
Are you working on that? Are those available yet?
Yeah, in fact, we're getting ready to, well, there's several published books out about different star stories. There's one called The Stars We Know, but I'm working with a production team to do a film on star stories of the Northern Plains. But what's so remarkable about that is it's like the sign language, is because, even though all the tribes have different languages and traditions, their star stories, a lot of them are just identical down to the very most minute detail. And you just have to wonder, how could they become so alike if their languages were so different? And I just keep coming back to this idea that they must have spent a lot of time with each other, learning each other's songs, learning each other's stories, ceremonies.
Ultimately, they all came back from common ancestry. That's part of it.
That's another great thing that we want to do with the genetic study, is to figure that all out. So, well, thank you. Yep.
We have a planetarium here in town. And the only star stories we have, well, not the only, but most of the star stories we have are the Greek ones.
Yeah.
And I want, as soon as you do your production.
Yep.
I want it to come so I can show it.
Yeah, I've done at the Museum of the Rockies.
Okay.
I've done a Star Stories thing when they're planetarium. And it was fun, but they don't have anything recorded yet. We're trying to do a film, and so we've been pitching it. We already asked Netflix and Disney. They both said no. So, but we're not giving up. There's a lot of streaming, so we're still going to keep going. Did you have a question?
I had a comment. If you're gonna go see the medicine wheel, make sure it's open.
Yeah. Good point.
The road didn't open up till, the highway didn't open up till May 29th this year.
Yeah.
And she said the medicine wheel was still under snow at that time, so we didn't get to see it this summer.
This year, it was under snow.
Yeah. I know I've tried to take groups up there because I host a lot of groups over the years to Crow Agency, and it's always an issue. Yeah.
I was wondering if you yourself have like a spiritual name and anything.
Do I have a Crow name?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. My name is Old Buffalo Bull. I didn't bring my vest actually, but yeah, I got that name from my clan father, and he actually got the name when he fasted in the Bighorn Mountains. And yeah, a big cloud came over him that looked like an old buffalo bull. So that's where he got the name. So my name, yeah.
Did you know Theo Hudson Bear at Fort Smith?
Oh yeah, I know Theo.
He's a very good friend of mine.
Oh yeah.
I had a place up there for about 18 years.
Oh, okay.
Fort Smith. I used to sit and listen to her talk for hour by the hour.
She's awesome. I went to school with her daughter, same age as me.
She was an awesome lady.
Yeah, she's great, isn't she? Yeah, there's some really good people back home. I feel very fortunate to come from the community that I do. Yep. Thank you all so much. Very gracious.
Yes, thank you very much. That was amazing. You're gonna stick around, right? You're staying in town tonight.
Yeah.
So if you have further questions, catch him. Don't let him go, right?
Yep.
Tomorrow is Smithsonian Museum Day around the country. So we are participating, and that means you get free attendance tomorrow. So tell your family, friends, come on in, see all the exhibits. If you're gonna be traveling, check out, see if there might be a free museum somewhere else. So I know there's several around the region that are offering free admission. And then next Saturday, we are hosting the Native Memory Project from the Wind River Reservation. So we're excited about that. They're gonna be talking about traditional medicines, storytelling, discussing historical trauma, and of course, healing from that trauma. So we're excited to have them 11 to 3 next Saturday. October 5th is Mary Kelly presentation. She's talking about her new book, Campbell County, Past and Present. That'll be 7 o'clock here in this room on October 5th. And then the Evelyn Cameron photography exhibit will be ending at the end of September. So if you haven't seen that, that's photographs from Eastern Montana from approximately 1890 to 1920. So come and see that. That is in the other building on our Roy Lowe Memorial exhibition wall. So you'll want to check that out. Otherwise, thank you again for coming. Thanks to the Rockpile Museum Association. Please enjoy the exhibits and mingle. Have a good night.
The next Saturday, 11 to 3 is that, yeah, one, but we get, yeah. Yeah.
Like the state direction.
Yeah.